The town of Crestwood, Ohio, was the kind of place where life moved at a comforting hum, nestled between rolling fields and quiet streets. The gas station still sold coffee for $1, and the local diner, Marge's Griddle, was the only place open past 9 p.m. It was here, after another grueling late-night shift at the Crestwood Regional Hospital, that Emily Parker found herself. At 28, Emily had developed a rhythm in her life. Nursing demanded long hours and emotional stamina, but she had grown adept at compartmentalizing the stresses. She even enjoyed the stillness of the late hours, less traffic, fewer interactions. That night, however, the air carried a subtle heaviness. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe it was something else. The diner was almost empty, the kind of quiet that amplified every creak and shuffle. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the lone waitress, a woman older than the establishment itself, gave Emily a nod as she walked to the restroom. Inside, the bathroom was predictably utilitarian. Peeling wallpaper, a broken soap dispenser, and a flickering bulb above the mirror. But Emily's eyes caught something unusual as she closed the stall door. Crudely scratched into the wood, just at eye level, was a string of numbers, 559. The handwriting was jagged, as if done in a rush. Emily tilted her head, a frown forming. She knew better than to give it much thought. Graffiti in a public restroom wasn't exactly rare, though this felt different. There was no accompanying message, no crude drawing, just the stark simplicity of the number. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't pinpoint. She finished quickly, washed her hands, and stepped out, telling herself it didn't matter. As she passed the stall, her gaze flickered back to the number. She hesitated but shook her head. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered, stepping back into the warm embrace of the diner. The night felt colder as she drove home, even though the radio hummed softly in the background. She parked her car in the small lot beside her apartment, climbed the stairs, and let herself into her space. A cozy, orderly sanctuary that smelled faintly of lavender. But the number lingered in her mind, an unwelcome passenger in her thoughts. She didn't call it. Of course she didn't call it, then what would be the point? Instead, she chalked it up to exhaustion and buried herself under her comforter, willing sleep to come quickly. It wasn't until she drifted off that the disquiet of the number began to seep into her dreams. The days that followed were uneventful at first, almost too uneventful. Emily returned to her routine of late-night shifts, errands, and the occasional phone call with her mom. But the quiet unease that had taken root in her mind didn't dissipate. Instead, it spread, growing heavier with each passing hour. It began subtly with something she almost dismissed. On a chilly Thursday morning after finishing a double shift, Emily walked to her car in the hospital's dimly lit parking lot. She fumbled for her keys, her breath fogging in the cold air, when something caught her eye. Etched into the thin layer of frost on her windshield was a number, 550199. Her stomach sank. She told herself it was a coincidence, a prank. Maybe someone had seen the same number at the diner and thought it would be funny. She wiped the frost away with her gloved hand and drove home, convincing herself there was no connection. But her grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles white. The next incident was harder to dismiss. On her desk at work, her desk inside the nurse's station, someone had scrawled the same number on a sticky note. Emily found it during a routine round, her heart pounding as she stared at the familiar sequence of digits. "Who left this here?" she asked aloud, her voice sharper than intended. Her colleague Shannon glanced over. "Left what?" Emily held up the note. Shannon shrugged. "Wasn't me. Maybe it's from the pharmacy. They leave stuff all the time." But Emily knew it wasn't from the pharmacy. She crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, her pulse still racing. Over the next few days, the number appeared in places Emily couldn't ignore. Scribbled on the inside of a grocery bag, written faintly in the condensation on her bathroom mirror. Once, she swore she saw it flash across her phone screen in the brief moment before the device powered down. Her anxiety began to fester. Sleep became elusive, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who was doing this? And why? Her friends started to notice her distraction. At lunch with her best friend Claire, Emily tried to broach the topic. "Have you ever seen this number before?" she asked, sliding a napkin across the table with 55500199 scrawled in pen. Claire frowned. "What's this about?" "Nothing," Emily lied. "Just something I've been seeing around." Claire chuckled, assuming it was a joke. "It's probably some loser looking for attention. Don't waste your time on it." But it wasn't funny to Emily. The number felt like a stain she couldn't scrub out of her life. The turning point came late one night. Emily had been tossing and turning in bed, her body tense and restless. Around 3:00 a.m., her phone buzzed from the nightstand. Groggy and irritated, she reached for it, expecting a work alert or spam message. It wasn't. The text was from an unknown number, 5550199. The message contained no words, just a single photograph, a blurry shot of her car parked outside her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat. She bolted to the window, yanking the curtain aside. The street below was empty, silent except for the occasional rustle of wind. But the sight of her car, precisely as it had appeared in the photo, made her knees weak. Panic surged through her veins. She called the number, her hand trembling so violently she almost dropped the phone. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then a voice answered. But it wasn't a voice, it was static, a harsh, grating hiss that made her ears ache. She pulled the phone away, her heart pounding in her ears, and hung up. That night, she barely slept. Every creak in the apartment made her flinch. Every shadow on the wall felt alive. The next morning, she called her landlord, asking if they'd seen anyone around her unit. The answer was the same as always. Says, "No, everything's been quiet." By now, Emily's fear had morphed into obsession. She couldn't focus at work, snapping at coworkers and making careless mistakes. The number consumed her thoughts. She began scouring the internet, looking for any reference to 55599, but every search came up empty. Her friends grew concerned, even staging a mini intervention. "You're not yourself lately," Claire said. "What's really going on?" Emily couldn't tell her. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand? Instead, she distanced herself further, retreating into her apartment and locking the doors. The text messages came more frequently now. Each one was the same, just the number over and over, sometimes with a picture of Emily's car, her building, or even her hospital locker. The worst part was the creeping sense that someone was always watching. She began catching glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting behind a parked car, a figure disappearing around the corner. Once, while walking home, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. She spun around, but the street was empty. The number wasn't just following her, it was closing in. The strain of living under constant surveillance had driven Emily to the brink. She barely left her apartment except to go to work, and every errand felt like a calculated risk. Her dreams were fragmented, full of shadowy figures and the relentless echo of that number, 5550199. Each day felt heavier than the last. But Emily wasn't ready to give in. One sleepless night, she resolved to take control. If she couldn't escape the number, she would find out what it meant. She had no idea where the search would lead her or how close it would hit to home. Emily started with the basics. She revisited the diner restroom where she had first seen the number. The scrawl was still there, unchanged. She asked the waitress if she'd noticed anything strange about it. "Oh, that?" the woman said, squinting at the stall door. "Been there for years. Kids like to mess around. Probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Emily felt it in her bones. She jotted the number down again and returned home, diving into every online resource she could find. Reverse phone lookups yielded no results. Local forums mentioned nothing unusual about 555. The internet, it seemed, held no answers. Then she stumbled upon a name in an old news article. Jason Miller, a teenager from Crestwood who had gone missing 5 years ago. The case had gone cold, but Emily noticed something chilling, a vague reference to an anonymous tip received by police. The tip had been made from an untraceable number, 5550199. Emily's blood ran cold. The number wasn't random, it had a history. As Emily delved further into the case, she uncovered something even more disturbing. Jason had been a close friend of her brother, David Parker, who had died in a car accident the same year Jason vanished. She didn't remember Jason well, just a quiet boy who had hung around their house occasionally. But the timing was too coincidental. Emily called her mother, feigning casual curiosity. "Mom, do you remember Jason Miller? He used to be friends with David." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about him now?" I saw something that reminded me of him." "Did anything strange happen with him before David's accident?" Her mother hesitated, then sighed. "Jason disappeared not long after David passed. It was tragic, but I didn't think they were connected." Why are you asking this, Emily? Emily didn't answer. She ended the call quickly, her hands shaking. The connection between the two boys was undeniable. But what did it mean? And why was the number targeting her now? The deeper Emily dug, the more the number seemed to lead her toward one place, an abandoned house on the outskirts of Crestwood. It had once belonged to Jason's uncle and was the last place Jason had reportedly been seen before his disappearance. The house was infamous in town, rumored to be haunted, though no one ever explained why. Emily hesitated. The thought of going to the house alone was terrifying, but she knew she couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. She packed a flashlight, her phone, and a crowbar for good measure. The house loomed like a dark silhouette against the night sky, its broken windows and sagging roof giving it an air of menace. Emily parked her car a safe distance away and approached cautiously. The front door was unlocked, its hinges groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, the scent of rot and mildew making her gag. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing graffiti-covered walls, broken furniture, and scattered debris. She climbed the creaking stairs, her heart pounding with every step. At the end of the hallway, she found a small bedroom. On the far wall, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting she'd seen in the diner, were the numbers 55550199. They covered the wall in endless repetition, as though someone had been trapped here, obsessively etching the digits into the plaster. As Emily stood frozen, a movement caught her eye. In the corner of the room where the light barely reached, a figure shifted. She swung the flashlight toward it, and her breath hitched. It was Jason, or what looked like Jason. His features were gaunt, his skin pale as ash. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto hers. "Why are you doing this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jason's mouth moved, but his words were barely audible, a whisper carried by the void. "The number. It's a door." Emily stepped back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "A door to what?" Jason didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the wall. The numbers, scratched over and over, began to shift before her eyes, aligning into a strange, intricate pattern. The air grew colder, and a low hum vibrated through the room, as if the house itself was alive. The realization hit Emily like a punch to the chest. The number wasn't just a message, it was an invocation. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy with an unnatural chill. The hum that had started faintly now reverberated through the house, deep and rhythmic, as though some unseen force was waking up. Jason, or the thing that looked like Jason, remained motionless in the corner. His hollow eyes followed her, but his face was void of emotion. "The number is a door," he had said, and now the numbers on the wall were moving. Emily's flashlight flickered as the digits twisted and stretched, forming an intricate circular design across the wall. She recognized it as a sigil, something far beyond her understanding, but ancient and malevolent. The pattern pulsed faintly with light, like a heartbeat, and the hum deepened, filling her chest with dread. Jason's voice came again, faint but deliberate. "They used me to open it. They'll use you next." Emily's throat tightened. "Who? What are you talking about?" Jason stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if his body resisted his will. "The cult. They need a conduit, someone to finish the ritual. They marked me, and now they've marked you." "No." Emily shook her head, backing away. "No, I don't. This doesn't make any sense." Jason's face twisted, his features contorted with pain. "It's too late. They're already here." A loud creak echoed from below. Emily's head snapped toward the doorway as the sound of footsteps rose from the floorboards. They were deliberate and slow, the kind of steps meant to announce presence and power. The cult had come for her. Emily scrambled to block the door, jamming her crowbar beneath the doorknob, but the footsteps grew closer, accompanied by faint whispers. They were speaking in a language Emily couldn't understand, their voices overlapping in a dark, melodic chant. She turned back to Jason, desperate. "What do they want? How do I stop this?" Jason's voice was barely audible now, his words strained. "Break the cycle. Destroy the door." The sigil on the wall pulsed brighter, casting the room in a sickly glow. Emily didn't understand the mechanics of what was happening, but her gut told her Jason was right. Whatever that sigil was, it had to be destroyed. She swung the flashlight at the wall, shattering the glass and plunging the room into near darkness. Grabbing the crowbar, she attacked the wall with every ounce of strength she had. Plaster and wood splintered under her blows, but the sigil remained intact, its light glowing brighter with each strike. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Emily could see shadows shifting under the door, multiple figures standing just outside. The chanting grew louder, filling the room like a physical force. Her head throbbed, and the room felt as if it were tilting. "Come on!" she screamed, slamming the crowbar into the sigil one last time. A deafening crack split the air, and the wall shattered outward, revealing something behind it, a void of endless blackness. The hum transformed into a roar as the house seemed to buckle, the walls trembling violently. From the void, something reached out. Emily couldn't see it clearly, but she felt it, an overwhelming presence, ancient and malicious, clawing its way toward her. The door burst open and the cultists spilled into the room. Their faces were obscured by dark hoods, but their movements were methodical, their chanting never faltering. They didn't seem to notice the roaring void or the trembling house. Their focus was solely on Emily. One of them stepped forward, holding a curved dagger etched with symbols that matched the sigil. The figure raised the blade, its intention clear. Emily gripped the crowbar tighter. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The figure lunged. Emily swung with all her might, connecting with the figure's arm and sending the dagger clattering to the floor. She dove for it, gripping the handle tightly as she turned toward the wall. The sigil's light pulsed wildly, as though the void was fighting to stay open. With no time to think, Emily plunged the dagger into the center of the sigil. The effect was immediate. A piercing scream erupted from the void, a sound that wasn't human. The cultists froze, their chant breaking as the light from the sigil intensified, flooding the room with blinding brightness. The house groaned, its foundations trembling as though it were tearing itself apart. Jason's voice cut through the chaos. "Run!" Emily didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out into the freezing night air. Behind her, the house began to collapse in on itself, the roar of the void swallowing the sound of splintering wood and crumbling stone. Emily ran until her lungs burned, not stopping until she reached her car. She looked back just once to see the house consumed in total darkness, its outline fading as though it had never existed. For a brief moment, silence returned, broken only by her ragged breathing. She climbed into the car, locked the doors, and sat there trembling. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Dreading what she might see, she pulled it out. It was a text from an unknown number, 555-499. The message read, "This isn't over." Emily sat in her car, the cold metal of the dagger still clutched in her shaking hand. Her chest heaved, her mind racing as she stared at the glowing text on her phone. This isn't over. The house was gone, the cult, the sigil, the void. All of it had disappeared into the collapsing structure. But the message made it clear. The terror had not ended. Her phone buzzed again. This time there was no text, just an audio file. Against her better judgment, she pressed play. It was static at first, harsh and grating, but beneath it, a faint voice whispered her name, over and over. Emily. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat, gripping the steering wheel to steady herself. The memory of the sigil burned in her mind, its glowing pattern etched into her vision. For a moment, she thought about calling the police, but what could she say? That a number was haunting her? That she'd just escaped a collapsing house filled with hooded strangers? They'd think she was insane. Over the next few days, Emily tried to return to her routine, but everything felt off. The shadows in her apartment seemed darker, the nights quieter. She avoided her phone as much as possible, terrified of seeing another message. The dagger remained hidden in a drawer, a grim reminder of what she'd been through. She began noticing the number again, though less frequently now, on a flyer taped to a lamppost, on a receipt left in her mailbox, scratched into the corner of a park bench. Each time she saw it, her heart raced, the air around her thickening with dread. Her friends urged her to seek help. Claire even suggested therapy. "Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone," she said. But Emily couldn't bring herself to explain. How could she make them understand? It wasn't just paranoia. The number wasn't random. It was alive, waiting for her to falter. Weeks passed, and for a brief time, the appearances of the number stopped. Emily began to hope, cautiously, that maybe the nightmare was truly over. She changed her routines, moved to a different apartment, and even switched hospitals, desperate to leave Crestwood and its horrors behind. For a while it worked. Her sleep improved, her hands stopped shaking, and the world began to feel normal again. The memory of the house, Jason, and the cult became distant, like a half-forgotten dream. But deep down, Emily knew it wasn't over. The number had embedded itself in her life, an invisible thread tying her to something she couldn't escape. One evening, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed again. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up. The screen was blank for a moment, then the same number appeared, 555-0199. This time it wasn't a text or an audio file, it was a voicemail. Emily hesitated, her thumb hovering over the play button. Every instinct told her not to listen, but curiosity got the better of her. The message began with static, just like before, but the voice that followed was different. It wasn't Jason's, it was her brother's. "Emily," the voice said, calm and deliberate. "It's me, David, you need to listen." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. Her brother had been dead for years, and yet here he was, speaking as though he'd never left. "They haven't stopped," the message continued. "The door wasn't closed, it's still open." The static grew louder, drowning out the rest of the message, but not before she heard one final phrase, whispered so faintly she almost missed it. "They're coming." Emily dropped the phone, her heart pounding. Her brother's voice was gone, replaced by the familiar silence of her apartment. She glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every creak and shadow. The number wasn't just a threat, it was a beacon, a connection to something larger and far more sinister. And now it was clear that her escape had been temporary. Whatever she had unleashed that night at the house was still out there, watching, waiting. Emily sat down, the weight of the truth settling over her. She had survived, but she hadn't won. The number would never truly leave her repertoire. It was a door, and it had been opened. What came through wasn't finished with her yet. Emily's life had become a fragile balancing act, teetering between moments of uneasy calm and the crushing dread of inevitability. She moved through her days like a ghost, haunted not only by the number, but by the unanswered questions it carried. Her brother's voice on the voicemail replayed in her mind. The door wasn't closed, it's still open. This wasn't just about her anymore. The number was part of something far larger, something that didn't care about time, space, or her desperate attempts to escape. And Emily knew, deep in her gut, that the worst was yet to come. The number's appearances grew more sporadic, but no less chilling. A faint etching in a doctor's office clipboard, a random receipt left in her shopping cart. Each time, Emily felt the same cold, suffocating sense of being watched. The number wasn't merely a message, it was a reminder, a marker of its constant presence. Her brother's connection to it gnawed at her. If David's death and Jason's disappearance were tied to the number, then perhaps she had inherited a role in this twisted cycle. The cult, the sigil, the house, they had been players in a much larger game, one that Emily was only beginning to understand. But how could she fight something she couldn't see? Something that reached across years, taking lives and twisting them into its design. The haunting connection to her brother forced Emily to confront unresolved guilt. She hadn't been in the car the night of David's accident. She'd begged off going to a party with him, choosing instead to stay home. His death had always felt like a punishment for her choice. Now the number made her wonder if his accident hadn't been random at all. The voicemail replayed in her mind constantly. They haven't stopped. They're coming. What if David had known about the number before he died? What if Jason's disappearance had been an attempt to protect her? Emily couldn't bear the thought that her family had been ensnared in something so dark while she had been oblivious. The weight of her survival felt unbearable, as though she had been spared for a reason she couldn't yet fathom. One night, Emily returned to her apartment to find the number waiting for her, this time scrawled on her kitchen counter in a substance she didn't want to identify. Her hands trembled as she stared at it, the digits burning into her mind like a brand. She tried to scrub it away, but it wouldn't fade. The message was clear. She couldn't run anymore. She had to face it, whatever it was. Emily sat down, her breathing uneven. For the first time since the nightmare began, she made a choice. She would stop running. The answers weren't going to come to her, they never had. The number wasn't finished with her, but she wasn't finished with it either. She pulled out her phone and stared at the keypad. Her fingers hesitated over the numbers. But then she began to dial. 5 5 5 0 1 9 9. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then a voice answered. It wasn't static this time. It wasn't David or Jason. It was her own voice. Emily, the voice on the other end said, calm and deliberate. It's time. The call ended before she could respond. Emily stared at the phone, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear. The number wasn't just a door, it was a summons. And now she had answered. Emily's story ends not with resolution, but with uncertainty. The number remains an enigma, a terrifying symbol of forces beyond comprehension. It had taken Jason, consumed her brother, and now it had claimed her. Whether she would become another victim or find a way to break the cycle was a question left unanswered. The final image is of Emily, sitting alone in her dark apartment, staring at her phone as it buzzes again. The screen lights up with a new text from 555-0199. This time the message reads, "Welcome home.